Ever get that feeling like the deck is kind of stacked against you?
Oh, yeah.
You know, the American dream, the whole idea that if you work hard, you'll get ahead. It's fading away.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today with Noam Chomsky's Requiem for the American Dream.
Okay.
He basically says there are these 10 kind of hidden principles at work designed to like concentrate all the wealth and power at the top.
And what's really fascinating is that Chomsky doesn't just like lay out these principles, he backs them up
Oh, yeah.
with tons of evidence.
What kind of evidence?
We're talking like court rulings, historical documents, you name it. There's even this wild analysis from Citigroup basically saying, hey, investors, you know what? Ignore everyone else. Just focus on the super rich.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
So that Citigroup report was just like a real head scratcher. It's like they're saying inequality is like an investment strategy now.
Pretty much, yeah. Huh. So I guess our mission for this deep dive is kind of twofold. First, we'll try to unpack these 10 principles.
Okay.
But more importantly, we'll look at how they might actually be playing out like in your life right now.
Right, right.
So get ready to get a little uncomfortable, maybe.
Absolutely. And there's no better place to start than with Chomsky's first principle, which might surprise some people.
Oh, yeah.
It's reduced democracy.
Reduced democracy. Okay, I gotta admit, that one kind of threw me for a loop at first.
Yeah.
I mean, America's supposed to be like, you know, the land of the free, the beacon of democracy, right?
Exactly.
But Chomsky's saying that the powerful have always tried to limit the influence of everyday people.
Precisely. And he takes us all the way back to the founding fathers to make this point.
Huh.
Like James Madison. In the secret proceedings and debates, you know, he actually expressed concern about protecting the minority of the opulent against the majority.
Wow. Okay, that sounds a little un-American today.
Yeah.
But I guess it kind of shows this tension between like democratic aspirations and elite control.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that tension's been there from the very beginning.
So it's like this built-in conflict baked into the system itself.
Yeah, I'd say so.
That's a bit unsettling.
It is. And we see it play out throughout American history, you know, like think about the struggle for women's suffrage or the civil rights movement.
Right.
Huge shifts.
Right.
Driven by the desire for more democratic participation. But they were met with fierce resistance.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Those movements threaten the existing power structure.
Yeah.
So how does this whole reduced democracy idea, you know, show up in more recent times?
You know, fast forward to 1971.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have the Powell Memorandum. Lewis Powell, you know, he later became a Supreme Court justice.
Yeah.
We're warned that businesses were losing control. And he called for this like coordinated counteroffensive. He argued that corporations needed to get more politically active to protect their interests.
That's pretty blatant, isn't it? I mean, he's straight up saying corporations get into politics.
Yeah, it's pretty direct. And this sentiment was echoed just a few years later by the Trilateral Commission.
Okay, and who are they?
Well, it's a group of influential people from like North America, Europe, and Japan. And in 1975, they put out this report called The Crisis of Democracy.
Oh, okay.
And in it, they actually say they're concerned about an excess of democracy.
Hold on, an excess of democracy. What does that even mean?
Right. Well, they argued that too much public participation was like destabilizing. And they called for more, moderation in democratic processes.
So basically, less democracy.
Yeah, basically. They even go as far as to advocate for better indoctrination of the young.
Indoctrination of the young. That sounds pretty Orwellian, to be honest.
It does, doesn't it?
Okay, but I see what you mean. There's this consistent feel, right, of the public having too much power,
Right.
which to me feels like the opposite of the whole idea of democracy.
Exactly. And it raises some important questions for us to consider.
Like what?
Like, are there ways, maybe subtle, maybe not, that our participation in democracy is being limited today? Are our voices being heard? Or are they being drowned out by powerful interests?
Those are some big questions, and they're questions that we'll definitely be revisiting throughout this deep dive. But for now, let's shift gears to principle #3, redesign the economy.
Okay. This one gets into how the U.S. economy has just, fundamentally transformed over the past few decades. Chomsky argues that there's been this deliberate shift away from production and towards something he calls Financialization.
Financialization. Okay. So what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, what is that?
Is that just a fancy way of saying that that Wall Street's calling the shots now?
Well, it's more than just Wall Street. It's a broader trend,
Right?
where financial institutions and markets become more and more dominant,
Mm-hmm.
often at the expense of the real economy, the part that actually produces stuff.
Okay, I see. So how did we get here? Was there like a specific turning point?
Well, one big shift happened back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
With the dismantling of the Bretton Woods system.
Oh, okay. Refresh my memory. What was that again?
Yeah. So this system, it was set up after World War II. It created like fixed exchange rates between currencies,
Okay.
which helped to, stabilize the global economy. But when it was abandoned, it led to this surge in currency speculation.
Wait, so people were basically betting on the value of currencies. How does that even work?
Imagine buying and selling currencies like you would stocks,
Yeah.
right? Hoping to profit from fluctuations in their value.
Okay.
That's currency speculation in a nutshell.
Huh. And that's profitable.
Oh, incredibly profitable for those who know how to play the game.
Okay. But I can see how that could be really destabilizing too.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have this rise of financial speculation, but how does that connect to the decline of the real economy? The manufacturing jobs, the factories, all that.
Well, think about it this way. If companies can make more money by, manipulating finances than by actually making things,
Yeah.
where are they going to put their resources?
So this is where offshoring comes in.
Exactly.
Companies moving production to countries where labor's cheaper, regulations are weaker.
And Chomsky uses a pretty relatable example to illustrate this. Apple. I mean, we all know Apple products, right?
Right.
But most of them made overseas, places like China.
Yeah, makes sense. So while financial institutions are making huge profits, those factory jobs are disappearing. And the people who still have those jobs, they're facing, stagnant wages and insecure work. That's a pretty grim picture.
It is. And it gets even more unsettling when you factor in that Citigroup report.
The one you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So in 2005, they put out this document called Plutonomy, Buying Luxury, Explaining Global Imbalances.
Catchy title.
Right. And basically, their advice to investors was to focus on the plutonomy, the super rich.
Okay.
Because they're the ones driving consumption globally.
So they're saying, forget everyone else. Just cater to the super rich.
A pretty bold strategy.
Yeah.
And I think it says a lot about, the priorities of our economic system right now.
Yeah, it does. And it creates this huge gap, right, between the plutonomy at the top
Right.
and what Chomsky calls the precariat. Those folks struggling with insecure jobs and dwindling opportunities.
That's exactly right. And it begs the question, where do you fit in to this new economic landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question to think about. And I have a feeling it's one that's going to become even more relevant as we go deeper into Chomsky's analysis. Speaking of which, his next principle, shift the burden, really shines a light on how this economic redesign plays out in people's lives.
It certainly does. And it's a principle that's deeply intertwined with this decline of the American dream.
Okay, let's get into it then. Shift the burden. What's that all about?
Oh, we'll dive into that next time.
All right, sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
So this idea of shifting the burden, it feels kind of familiar,
Yeah.
Like we hear about it all the time, but maybe without the fancy label.
Right.
Is this about how the costs of things keep going up, like healthcare, education, all that while wages just stay the same?
It's definitely part of it. Yeah. Chomsky's argument is that, the responsibility for keeping society running, providing those essential services and opportunities,
Yeah.
it's been shifted away from the wealthy
Okay.
and put on to everyone else.
And that seems like a pretty big change from how things used to be. Didn't we have a time in America where things felt more balanced?
Absolutely. The
Yeah.
decades after World War II, there was this sense that shared prosperity was important for a healthy economy.
Mm-hmm.
Even Henry Ford,
Yeah.
a titan of industry, he understood this.
Really?
He famously raised worker salaries so they could afford to buy his cars. It was a recognition that you need a thriving middle class
Yeah.
for economic growth.
Makes sense. But it feels like that idea has been totally flipped on its head now.
It has, yeah. Since the 1970s, we've seen a huge shift towards policies that benefit the wealthy,
Okay.
often at the expense of everyone else.
So, what are we talking about here?
Think about the reduction in taxes on corporations and high earners.
Right.
The argument's always that these cuts will stimulate investment and create jobs.
Yeah.
But the evidence just doesn't back that up.
Yeah. It seems like we always hear that trickle-down economics is going to work, but it never really trickles down, does it?
Exactly. Chomsky points to companies like General Electric, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've reported massive profits while paying basically no taxes.
Wow.
And it's not just anecdotes either. In 2014, Standard & Poor's, a major financial analysis firm,
Yeah.
released a report that said income inequality was actually holding back economic growth.
So even the financial experts are saying that this concentration of wealth at the top is bad for the economy as a whole. That's a pretty big deal.
It is.
Yeah.
And while these corporations are enjoying record profits and tax breaks, you know what's happening.
Right.
Our infrastructure's falling apart.
Yeah.
Education's underfunded and healthcare costs are through the roof.
It's like we're getting squeezed from both sides, right? We're paying more for essential services, but our wages aren't going up and the safety net is shrinking.
That's the essence of shifting the burden,
Yeah.
It's about dismantling the public sphere while making the rich even richer.
Okay.
And it's having a big impact on our politics, too. Think about the 2016 election.
Oh, yeah?
Bernie Sanders, right?
Mm-hmm.
He campaigned on policies like universal health care and free college tuition.
Yeah.
And a lot of people saw him as a radical.
That's crazy. Those ideas would have been totally normal just a few decades ago.
Exactly. The Overton window, the range of acceptable political discourse
Right.
has shifted so far to the right that policies that would help most Americans are now seen as extreme.
So Chomsky's saying that this shift is directly tied to shifting the burden.
That's right. If you can convince people that the government is the problem, that social programs are wasteful, and that taxes are like tyranny, then you can justify getting rid of the systems that help ordinary people.
It's a pretty smart strategy if you're the one who benefits from it.
Yeah.
But it's devastating for everyone else. So the question for our listeners is, are your taxes basically subsidizing the lifestyles of the super rich while essential services are being starved?
It's a tough question to think about.
Yeah, it is.
But we have to grapple with it, because if we don't, this is just going to keep happening. And it's not just about our money either.
No.
It's about our social fabric breaking down, community falling apart, and the rise of isolation and despair.
Which brings us to principle #5, attack solidarity.
Yeah.
This one feels really relevant today with all this focus on individualism.
Yeah.
It's like we're constantly told to just look out for ourselves and forget about everyone else.
Chomsky argues that this focus on individualism is a deliberate strategy
Okay.
to prevent people from working together and challenging the way things are.
So it's about dividing us.
Yeah, dividing and conquering, making us fight each other instead of the systems that are oppressing us.
It's kind of ironic, though, right? Even Adam Smith, the father of capitalism,
Right.
he talked about the importance of sympathy and social responsibility.
It is ironic. It reminds us that even the biggest supporters of free markets knew that a healthy society needs some level of cooperation and compassion.
Yeah, but somewhere along the way we lost that message. So how do we see this attack on solidarity happening in the real world?
Just look at the constant attacks on Social Security.
Oh, yeah.
This program helps millions of elderly and disabled Americans.
Right.
And it embodies solidarity we all pay in to protect those who need it most.
And it's a really efficient program.
It is.
But it's always under attack by people who want to privatize it.
Exactly. Turn it into another way to make a profit.
And it's not just Social Security. Public education is another target. Remember the GI Bill after World War II? That made college affordable for millions of veterans.
Yeah, it fueled a period of incredible economic growth and social mobility.
Back then, we invested in people in our future, but now we have this student debt crisis. Young people are drowning in loans just for trying to get an education.
It's a stark contrast, and then you have healthcare. The U.S. has the most expensive and least efficient healthcare system in the developed world.
Why is that?
Largely because it's based on private insurance, not on shared responsibility.
Even Medicare, which is relatively efficient, and people, it faces constant attempts at privatization. It's like they're trying to get rid of any system that prioritizes the collective good over individual profit.
That's exactly it. And it raises a question for all of us.
What's that?
Are we buying into this idea that we're all alone, that it's every man for himself? Or are we willing to see the value in solidarity and working together to create a fairer society?
That's a powerful question, and it leads right into Chomsky's next principle, which I think is going to make a lot of people angry: run the regulators.
This one gets to the core of how power works in our society. Chomsky's saying that regulatory bodies,
the ones that are supposed to protect us.
Yeah, they're often controlled by the very industries they're supposed to be regulating.
So it's like the fox guarding the henhouse?
Exactly. And this is called regulatory capture. And it's been happening forever.
Give me an example.
Think about the railroads in the 19th century.
Okay.
They had so much power and influence,
Yeah.
and they used it to make sure the regulations benefited them.
At the expense of the public.
Often, yeah.
And we see this today too, right? With things like finance, pharmaceuticals, energy.
Absolutely. Chomsky uses a specific example to show this, the Glass-Steagall Act.
What was that?
It was a law passed during the Great Depression.
Okay.
It kept commercial banks and investment banks separate to prevent risky activities.
So it was meant to stop another financial crash.
Exactly. But in 1999, it was repealed,
Why?
thanks in part to people like Robert Rubin, who was Treasury Secretary under Clinton.
Okay.
And guess what? Rubin went on to work for Citigroup, one of the banks that benefited most from getting rid of that regulation.
It's like a revolving door. They go back and forth between government and industry, always looking out for themselves.
And it has consequences since the 1970s. The U.S. has had a bunch of financial crises, each one worse than the last.
Yeah, like what?
Continental Illinois in '84, Black Monday in '87, the savings and loan crisis under Reagan, the dot-com bubble in the late '90s, and of course the 2008 housing crash, the biggest since the Great Depression.
It's like a broken record, and each time it's taxpayers who end up paying for it.
Exactly. Chomsky points out that the very people who created these messes, the Robert Rubin crowd, the Goldman Sachs crowd, they were the ones put in charge of cleaning them up.
That's unbelievable. But haven't there been attempts to control the financial industry? What about Dodd-Frank after 2008?
Dodd-Frank was a start, but lobbyists weakened it, and it hasn't really stopped another crash from happening.
So the system is rigged, and even when there are reforms, they get sabotaged.
It can feel that way, yeah.
It's pretty disheartening. So the question for our listeners is, who's really in control of the regulations that affect your life? Are they working for you or for the wealthy and powerful?
That's the big question, and it leads us right into Chomsky's next principle, which is about our democracy engineer elections.
This is something people talk about a lot, but Chomsky goes deeper than just campaign finance and lobbying.
Right.
He's saying that our elections are designed to limit real democratic participation.
And this goes back to corporate personhood.
What's that?
It's this legal idea that corporations have the same rights as people.
Wait, so corporations are these businesses that are made to make money? They have the same rights as human beings? How did that even happen?
It's a long story.
Yeah.
But basically, over the last century, corporations have gotten more and more rights.
Okay.
Often through legal tricks and court decisions.
And how does corporate personhood affect our elections?
One thing it does is let corporations spend unlimited money to influence elections.
Right.
This was made clear by the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010.
I remember that case. It was really controversial, wasn't it, about how limiting corporate spending violated their free speech?
Exactly. And that argument is based on an earlier case, Buckley v. Vallejo, from 1976,
Okay.
which said that money is the same as speech.
So basically, if you have enough money, you have a louder voice in our democracy.
That's the idea. And it creates a system where elections are like auctions.
How so?
The highest bidders have the most influence on policy.
So our votes don't matter as much as corporate money. That's pretty messed up.
It is, and it's not just about the money itself.
Okay.
It's about how money shapes the entire political landscape. This political scientist, Thomas Ferguson,
Yeah.
he has a theory called the investment theory of politics.
Okay, what's that?
He says that it's not voters who have the most power in our system.
Then who?
It's investors, the people and corporations with all the money.
So our government listens to donors more than voters.
That's what he's arguing. And there's research showing how big money affects what issues are even talked about during campaigns. There was this article in Alternet in 2012 called Revealed, Why the Pundits Are Wrong About Big Money and the 2012 Elections. It shows how corporate interests often control what we even talk about in politics.
It's like we're trapped in a cycle. Money influences elections, and then the people who get elected owe favors to their donors, which makes the wealthy even more powerful.
Exactly. And that brings us to the question, does your vote really matter when corporations can spend unlimited amounts to influence elections?
That's a question we all need to think about. But even if we can somehow overcome the influence of money in politics, Chomsky says there's another problem, principle. #8, keep the rabble in line.
This is about how those in power try to silence dissent and keep control over the masses.
Okay, and Chomsky says a big part of this is destroying labor unions.
Right. Unions used to be really strong.
Yeah.
They fought for workers' rights, fair wages, safe working conditions, and a voice for workers in politics.
So they were a threat to the powerful.
They were, and that's why businesses fought them so hard. The history of labor in the U.S. is full of violence. Chomsky mentions a New York Times article from 1937. Ford men beat and rout Lewis, union organizers. 80,000 out in Steel Strike 16 hurt in battle. It shows how brutal they were in trying to stop unions from forming.
It's crazy to think that was happening here. Isn't the right to organize a basic human right?
It is, but the U.S. never agreed to the main rule of the International Labor Organization,
What's that?
which says people have the right to form unions.
Wow, we're one of the few countries that hasn't agreed to that. It makes sense, though, given all the anti-union feeling here.
It does, and this hostility towards unions has always been there.
But haven't there been times when the labor movement made progress? What about during the New Deal?
The New Deal was a big moment for labor. Lots of new unions formed, and President Roosevelt, while he wasn't always totally supportive of unions, he understood that workers needed protection. He even told labor leaders to make me do it. He knew that public pressure was powerful.
So even back then, people knew that they had the power to make change happen.
Absolutely. And workers made a lot of gains during the New Deal, but then came the post-war business offensive.
What happened?
The Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which was passed, even though President Truman vetoed it, really limited what unions could do.
Okay.
And then there was McCarthyism,
Right.
which used the fear of communism to attack and silence labor activists.
So they used laws and propaganda to weaken unions.
Exactly. And it worked really well by the 1970s. Even the head of the United Auto Workers was saying that businesses were waging a one-sided class war against workers.
Wow.
It got even worse under Reagan. He famously busted the air traffic controllers' strike in 1981.
Yeah, I remember that.
It showed that the government wasn't on the side of labor anymore.
And what happened after that?
It made corporations more aggressive in their anti-union tactics.
Like what?
Illegal firings and strike breaking.
So today, less than 7% of private sector workers in the U.S. are in unions. That's a huge drop from when the labor movement was strong.
It is, and it's not because workers don't want unions.
Yeah.
Most Americans actually support them.
Then what's the problem?
It's that they've been blocked from organizing.
So it's not a lack of support for unions, it's a lack of power that's really depressing, but it also shows how effective these tactics for silencing dissent have been.
It does, and that takes us to one of Chomsky's most relevant principles, especially today: manufacture consent.
This one feels especially important now with social media and all the information we're constantly bombarded with. It's like there are always messages trying to tell us what to think and believe.
Exactly. Chomsky argues that the public relations industry has become a powerful tool for getting people to agree to things that benefit the powerful.
Interesting.
It's about shaping public opinion not through force, but through persuasion and manipulation.
It's like that quote by David Hume, the philosopher.
Yeah.
He said that power is always on the side of the governed, but the people in charge stay in control by shaping how the masses think.
That's a perfect way to put it. And Chomsky says this industry really started growing in the early 20th century because the need to control a more informed and active population became clear.
So as people became more educated and involved, those in power needed new ways to stay in control.
Exactly. And one of the key figures in this story is Edward Bernays.
Who was he?
He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he's considered the father of public relations. He literally wrote the book on propaganda in 1928.
Okay, so this Bernays guy, what did he think about propaganda?
He said that most people were too irrational and emotional to make good decisions. So he believed that an intelligent minority, which of course included him, needed to guide and manipulate public opinion for the good of society.
Wow. That's a pretty elitist way of thinking.
It is, and his ideas were really influential. He came up with techniques for manipulating public opinion that are still used today.
Like what?
Appealing to emotions, creating artificial desires, and distracting people from the real issues.
And we see that everywhere, don't we? From advertising that tells us we need the latest gadget to political campaigns that focus on personality instead of real issues.
Absolutely. Remember how Obama won an award from the advertising industry in 2008 for his campaign.
Yeah.
It showed how effective these techniques can be.
So it's not just about selling products or candidates anymore. It's about controlling how we see the world.
That's right. It's about making us think we're thinking for ourselves while our opinions are being shaped by forces we don't even see.
So the question for our listeners is, are your opinions really your own, or have they been influenced by things you're not even aware of?
It's something we should all be thinking about, because if we don't know how we're being manipulated, then we're just puppets.
That's a scary thought, and it leads us to Chomsky's last principle, which ties everything together: marginalize the population.
This one explains how this system stays in power.
Okay.
By keeping people isolated, discouraging them from working together, and creating a sense of hopelessness.
So it's about making people feel powerless so they don't even try to change things.
Exactly. And it happens in a lot of ways. Think about all the anger and hate in our society. People are attacking each other, immigrants, minorities, anyone who seems different. And it's often misdirected, right?
That's so...
It's like people are taking their anger out on scapegoats instead of the systems that are actually causing their problems.
That's a classic divide and conquer tactic, turning us against each other so we don't unite against the real source of our problems.
Exactly. And Chomsky says this marginalization is intentional.
It's not just an accident.
Right. It's about keeping people distracted and divided so they don't realize they have the power to change things.
And this is where it all comes together, isn't it? We have these 10 principles working to concentrate wealth and power, undermine democracy, and keep people marginalized and powerless.
Exactly. It's a system that's designed to benefit a few at the expense of everyone else.
So is there any way to break out of this cycle?
Well, we'll talk about that next time.
So we've gone through all these 10 principles, and
yeah,
it's pretty bleak, right?
it can feel that way.
Like the system's designed to keep us down, to keep us fighting each other instead of focusing on the real problems.
It can definitely feel that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. But Chomsky doesn't just leave us with a sense of hopelessness.
Okay.
He offers a way forward,
Oh, okay.
a glimmer of hope.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
Okay.
What's the antidote to all this, then, the systemic marginalization?
Well, it starts with realizing we're not powerless.
Okay.
This system, it depends on us being passive, apathetic, believing that nothing can change.
So it's like we've been conditioned to just accept things as they are.
Exactly.
To believe that we're just, cogs in the machine.
Yeah, we're bombarded with all these messages telling us to just focus on individual success, consume more, distrust anyone who's different,
It's like a constant distraction.
It is.
Keeping us from seeing the bigger picture.
That's right. And the antidote is engagement.
Okay.
Participation, collective action.
Okay.
Chomsky points to examples like the civil rights movement, the labor movement in the 1930s when people organized and mobilized and demanded change.
Those are really inspiring examples, but it also feels like a different time, Like back then, people were more connected, more willing to fight for something bigger than themselves.
It's true. Those movements faced huge challenges.
Yeah.
But they showed how powerful collective action can be. And there are so many examples throughout history, of everyday people coming together to challenge oppressive systems.
Yeah.
And create a more just world.
So what can we learn from those movements then? How can we apply those lessons today?
First, we have to educate ourselves.
Okay.
We need to understand how the system works, how it keeps us divided and powerless. We need to think critically, question the stories we're being told.
So knowledge is power.
Yeah, but it's not enough just to be informed.
Right. We have to do something with that knowledge.
Exactly. We need to connect with each other, build coalitions, organize. We need to find our voices and make them heard.
But where do we even start? It just seems so overwhelming.
It can be daunting, but it doesn't have to be. There's so many ways to get involved.
Like what?
Supporting grassroots organizations, participating in direct action, creating alternative media platforms.
So there's no one right way.
Right. It's about finding what works for you and taking action.
Chomsky talks about finding new ways to be politically active, right?
He does.
Operating outside the traditional system.
Yeah, it's about being creative, strategic, persistent.
So it's not about waiting for someone else to lead.
No.
It's about taking responsibility for our own future.
Exactly. Chomsky ends Requiem for the American Dream with this powerful call to action.
Oh, yeah. What does he say?
He reminds us that the future is in our hands, but we have to fight for it.
So what does that mean for you, the listener? What are you willing to do to create the future you want to see?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves. The answer to that question is going to determine the course of our society, our democracy, our planet.
Well, we've covered a lot today, unpacking Chomsky's 10 principles. You know how the powerful maintain control? It's been thought-provoking.
Yeah.
And at times a little unsettling.
It's important to remember, though, that these principles aren't set in stone.
Okay.
They're strategies, tactics that we can challenge and overcome.
So it's not about despair.
Right.
It's about empowerment.
Exactly. It's about understanding the challenges we face, how power works, and then taking action.
To create a better world.
A more just world.
And that's what the deep dive is all about, right? Empowering you with knowledge and insights.
That's right.
So you can be an active part of shaping your own future.
Remember, the future, it doesn't just happen to us. We create it together.
This has been a deep dive into Noam Chomsky's Requiem for the American Dream. We encourage you to explore these ideas further, think critically, and find your voice because the future depends on it.